Chapter 2, Section 2 is order of operations. This is something that's good to review because you need to kind of train your brain to do math problems in this order. And until you do that, you're going to find you keep getting things wrong. I had people get it wrong on an algebra test just last week. And how I was going to start was to give you something like 12 plus 9 divided by 3 and try to convince you that my calculator was wrong. But we're running late, so I'm not going to bother doing that. But if you have 12 plus 9 divided by 3, I was going to say, well, 12 plus 9 is 21, divided by 3 is 7. But if you punch it into your calculator, it's going to give you a different answer. So the problem with getting 7 is, what did I do wrong when I was doing the 12 plus 9 then divided by 3? It should be...
So you have to divide 9 by 3 first.
Yep. So order of operations, you have to do the division before you do the addition. And if you take and punch that in blue in your calculator, it's going to automatically do that correctly for you, which wouldn't give you the 21. The phrase for remembering it, you learned it last year, was please, anyone?
Excuse my dear Aunt Sally.
Nice. And I write it a little bit differently than some of the teachers. I'm going to write the my and dear one right above the other. So my dear. And if you want a totally different word picture, spell aunt that way. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, like your little aunt on a leash. But, so these all stand for something? You guys were talking about that a minute ago.
Sundays.
So P stands for, you can just shout it out.
Parentheses.
Parentheses. E is going to be exponents.
Multiply.
Yep, so then we have multiply. So multiply and divide. Add and subtract. And as you do those, they'll often call it like evaluating an expression. If you have a bunch of numbers and you're trying to figure out what does that equal, or they'll give you something, ask you to just simplify it. What number does it equal? For those, you have to do order of operations in this direction. So you start out with parentheses, then you do exponents next, then multiplication, division, then addition, subtraction. You're not going to see any of the exponents yet in this section. Those will come later. But you go from left to right when, I'm going to say, trying to find a number answer to a problem. When finding a number answer to a problem. So my plan from here is to just give you a few examples and we can work through the examples. And my first one is, if I do a 2 plus 4, then if I do a little dot like this, it's not 4.5, that means 4 times 5. All right, and then I'll maybe like do my PEMDAS. So first thing, are there any parentheses? Nope. So we don't do any parentheses. There's no exponents, that's the E. So next we have to do multiplication and division. So we'd have to do what times what? And we get 20. Okay, so then we have the plus 2. So 22 for an answer. Good? If we were to take and do a second one, any questions on that one? Because I'm going to try to make one that's a little bit more beastly for the second thing.
Beastly.
So if I take, and for my next example, I'm going to do parentheses 2 plus 4, and then a 5 after it. So first of all, if there's no operation written in right there, what does that have to be? Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, whatever one I forgot. So anyone? Multiplication. Yep. If there's nothing written in between two things, we assume it's multiplication. All right, so parentheses first. We have to do the 2 plus 4 right there, and that gives us 6 in the parentheses. You could rewrite it with the parentheses there if you wanted to, but since there's nothing really left to do inside the parentheses, a lot of people just drop the parentheses. But make sure then you know it's multiplication still. And 6 times 5 is?
30.
30. So that one we're all right? As you do these on a quiz or test in particular, or even in your homework if you want to check your answers, I would really encourage you to show your steps. It's a little bit frustrating for everybody involved if you take a quiz and you don't show your work, and then you end up getting like a bunch of points off instead of just 1 or 2. That's supposed to be a 5 plus 3. with this, if we're looking just at the please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, this throws some people because are there any parentheses? No. Exponents? No. So next is multiplication and division. Well, actually, the weird one here is it's kind of like there's assumed parentheses in the numerator. Do you remember doing average problems? Where you take and you add the different numbers together. So we're going to average together, I wouldn't write this down, but 3 plus 2 plus 5 plus 1. Then we divide by 4 if we wanted the average. Remember talking about how after you type in that plus 1, you either had to hit equals or you had to put this whole numerator in parentheses? Because otherwise your calculator is just going to do the 1 divided by 4 and then add those other numbers to it. And it's the same sort of thing here. When you have a fraction, it's kind of like there's assumed parentheses in the numerator and the denominator. You have to combine the numerator and combine the denominator before you can actually do the division. So 5 plus 3 gives us 8. So you have to do that first. Then you can say 8 divided by 2 gives you 4. Ready for one last example? All right. If I were to do this one here, (7 plus 13 divided by 5 minus 9). Well, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So in parentheses, what do we do first inside the parentheses, Katie?
7 plus 13.
So perfect. So we have 20 divided by 5 in the parentheses. And I'm going to say 3 minus 9. Okay. Next step, what would you do next?
Oh wait, no, you divide.
Yep. So 20 divided by 5 is 4.
You don't need the parentheses.
Now you could put parentheses around the 4 if you wanted to, but since you're not really, there's no operations to do inside, you can skip that, as long as you recognize that it's multiplication. So we're done with parentheses. There are no exponents. So now we do multiplication and division next. So Tyler, what does that give us?
12.
Perfect.
Then minus 9.
12 minus 9. Then once we're done with that multiplication step, now we go over and finally we do our addition and subtraction. We're on this step right there. And 12 minus 9 gives us
3.
3. So final answer would be 3. The very last thing I just want to throw in front of you is going to be this. So the commutative property of addition and multiplication. Have you guys studied that before? Commutative? So commutative.
The what?
Commutative
and
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I remember that too.
I remember that a lot.
Okay.
Too.
It's probably still worth writing it down, especially if you forgot it. So commutative property of addition and multiplication. This is going to keep coming up year after year after year, especially eventually when you get to geometry class. But what it's really trying to say is this here. If you have a 3 plus 2, that's the same as 2 plus 3.
Oh, yeah.
Or you could do the same thing with multiplication. You could say maybe 4 times 5 equals 5 times 4. In other words, if you're adding numbers or if you're multiplying numbers, it doesn't matter what order you do them in. You could either do 3 plus 2 or you could do the 2 plus 3. The way that they'll write it later on in life is they'll say for all real numbers A and B, and then they'll say A plus B equals B plus A. Or A times B equals B times A. But the point for putting the letters in is that then it'll work for all real numbers A and B, that it could work for any number. Does that make sense for commutative property?
Yeah.
The associative property is going to be our last one. So the associative, so associative property of addition.
We just did addition.
Yep, this is associative though. And multiplication. Now I was wrong, this actually isn't my last one. But if I were to say, for this here, it'd be like if you have parentheses and 2 plus 3 inside parentheses, and then we'll put plus 4 on the outside. That equals 2 plus, and then you start your parentheses, 3 plus 4. In other words, if you have all addition if you're adding three numbers together, it doesn't matter if you add the first two together first and then add the third one, or if you add the second and third number first and then add the first one to it.
Do you like always slide it over?
Yep, it's just changing which order you're adding them in. So this works for addition. It also works for multiplication. So you could write the exact same thing but with multiplication in there. And you could pick different numbers if you wanted to. But 2 times 3 times 4. So it works for multiplication and addition. It's not going to work for other operations. It won't work for subtraction. You have to subtract from left to right. It won't work for division. But it'll work for both of those. A lot of people, and if you want to do the A and B's and C's, you could say in parentheses A times B, and then a times C equals A times B times C. For these, a lot of people struggle with keeping those straight. Try to get it all on one screen. I know I did, so I came up with this way to try to remember the two different things. If you have this commutative property, it kind of starts kind of like communication. So if I were to say something to one of you, Hank, how was your weekend?
Pretty scary.
Then he says something back to me, and then I'd say, really? Why was it scary?
Because my grandpa split his head open to a skull.
His grandpa split his head open to a skull. So there's this back and forth, agreed? So that's kind of like this here, that you have person A talking to person B in communication, and then you have that second person says something back to the first person. So commutative communication is kind of like A then B then A. It's kind of like me then Hank then me. You know, it's kind of that back and forth. Where associative property is kind of like that word associate, is changing who you hang out with. If you look at this thing here as being like three friends, it'd be kind of like Hank and I getting together and we're dissing Tyler. Hey, do you hear what Tyler did? Blah, 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 blah. You know, and then, so Hank and I are kind of like our little group of friends and we're being mean to somebody. And then, but then next, Hank goes over to Tyler, number 4, and he's kind of like hanging out with number 4, kind of like, can you believe what our teacher said? We should go get him in trouble. So associative property is changing like which numbers are associating, which numbers are hanging out with who. Does that help some?
Yep, I do. Yeah.
Okay. Then the final property we're going to look at today is the distributive property. At this level of math, distributive property isn't insanely helpful. They teach it, but a lot of you might be kind of wondering why. When you get a little bit down the road to where we start using more algebra stuff, more with letters, you're going to find that you need to use distributive property, and it comes in super handy. But it's something like this. If I were to have a 3 times maybe a 4 plus 6. So 3 times 4 plus 6. Whenever you have something times, and then something in parentheses with either addition or subtraction, that's going to be where the distributive property applies. That technically, do you agree, we need to add before we can multiply? Because it's in parentheses, you have to do the parentheses first. Well, if for some reason, like later on down the road, you're going to have this x plus 6 instead of the 4, and at that point you can't add x and 6 together, so you can't really do the problem, it seems, because you can't multiply because you need to add first, and you can't add first because you can't combine the x and the 6. So what distributive property does is it says, okay, 3 times 4 plus 6 in parentheses is the same as 3 times 4 and 3 times 6. So in other words, that's going to be a 3 times 4. And then I still have this positive 3 times a positive 6, so it gives me a plus 3 times 6. So it shouldn't matter which way I do my problem. If I stick with what's on the left and have 3 times 10, tells me my answer is 30. Thank you, Haley. Or you could do it this way here and say 3 times 4 is 12, plus 3 times 6 is 18, and 12 plus 18 gives me 30. So it shouldn't matter which way you do the problem at this point, you'll get the same answer. Most of your homework questions that ask this distributive property thing, though, what they're going to do is they're going to give you this part right here, and they're going to say, okay, write this after doing the distributive property, and they're looking for you to write it out like that thing there on the right. So that's how they're kind of testing you on it.